Story number 1.
It was a cold, stormy evening, the kind of night where the wind howls outside and the rain falls in sheets, drumming on the roof and windows. The air smelled of wet earth and damp wood, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the dark sky. I had been home alone for hours, my parents away visiting family, and the house was silent except for the sounds of the storm. I, being 19 at the time, was no stranger to being home alone. I had lived in this house for most of my life, and the familiar creaks of the old floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, and the whistling of the wind through the trees outside were all comforting to me. I was settled on the couch in the living room, a blanket draped over my lap, a cup of tea beside me. I had planned to spend the night watching movies, a little self-care after a hectic week of school and work. The house itself was large, with long hallways and high ceilings. My room was upstairs, and the living room, where I had settled in for the night, was downstairs. The house was a mix of old and new, with modern furniture but classic architecture that had stood the test of time. My parents were in the habit of keeping the windows closed, but tonight, despite the storm, I had cracked a few open, allowing the cool air to seep in. I had just settled into a movie when I heard a sound from upstairs. A creak. At first, I brushed it off. It was likely just the house settling. An old building like this one was bound to make strange noises, especially in bad weather. The wind rattling the windows could also cause vibrations. I turned up the volume on the TV and let myself get absorbed in the story. But then, the creak came again. This time, I paused the movie. The noise was louder, and it didn't sound like the house settling. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the quiet house. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat frozen, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. My first instinct was to call my parents, but then I remembered they were a few hours away, and it was a long drive. They wouldn't be able to help me immediately, even if I did call. The house felt suddenly very big and empty, and the idea of being alone in it, while something I had done countless times before, suddenly felt very overwhelming. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, hoping to distract myself. "Hey, everything okay? You busy?" I typed the message quickly, as if reaching out to someone would make me feel safer. She responded almost immediately. "Yeah, just studying. Why? Everything okay with you?" The storm was still raging outside, the wind howling louder now, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I quickly typed, "Just heard something weird upstairs, like footsteps. Could be nothing, though." I didn't expect a reply right away. She was busy with her own stuff, and I knew she wouldn't be able to do anything. Still, the response came soon after, which made me feel a little less alone. "That's weird. Maybe check it out? I can call the police if you need help." I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. I had never been the type to panic, but something about the silence that had followed the footsteps made me uneasy. I stood up slowly, my feet making quiet noises on the wooden floor. The house felt unnervingly quiet now, and I felt my pulse quicken. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen and crept toward the stairs. The sound of my own breathing was too loud in the silence, and I was trying to control the rising panic in my chest. As I reached the stairs, I hesitated. Should I check it out? What if it was just the wind? But then I heard the creak again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably coming from the hallway upstairs. I forced myself to move, placing my hand on the banister and slowly making my way up the stairs. The house felt so much bigger at night, the shadows of the stairwell stretching in every direction. The sound of the storm outside filled the house, but every creak and crack of the wood seemed amplified by the stillness. At the top of the stairs, I stood still, listening. Nothing. Just the rain pounding against the windows and the occasional thunder shaking the house. I felt my chest tighten as I took a step forward, my flashlight beam shaking slightly in my hand. I checked each room carefully, starting with my own. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, the light sweeping across the room. Nothing was out of place. I moved to the next room, my mind spinning. What if someone was here? What if I wasn't alone? The whole house felt like it was holding its breath. I moved toward the bathroom at the end of the hall, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No sign of anyone. It was just the house, dark and empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, feeling a little foolish for letting my mind wander. It was likely nothing, just the storm playing tricks on me, or maybe the house itself shifting with the wind. I turned to head back to the stairs when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time, they were much closer, right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the shadows stretching and shifting in the dim light. I felt my heart race, my breathing shallow and erratic. Was I imagining this? I moved quickly down the hallway, back toward the stairs, my footsteps muffled by the sound of the rain outside. But then I froze. At the top of the stairs, just beyond the corner, I saw something. A shadow. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello?" There was no answer. I gripped the railing tighter, my mind spinning. Should I go down and check? Should I call for help? I took a step back, but then a noise came from below me, something scraping against the floor. I turned my head, my heart hammering in my chest. It came from the living room. There was no way. My parents had locked everything before they left. I was sure of it. But the scraping sound continued, soft and unnerving. It sounded like someone, or something, dragging its feet across the floor. I gripped the flashlight tighter and slowly descended the stairs, my every sense on high alert. The sound grew louder, coming from just ahead. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. My throat tightened, and I could hear my own breath in the still air. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The living room was dark, but the dim light from the kitchen illuminated part of the floor. There, at the edge of the couch, was a shape. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if the shadows were playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn there was someone there. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash came from the back of the house, shattering the silence. I bolted toward the kitchen, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced as I looked around for any sign of where the noise had come from. The back door, the windows, everything seemed fine. There was no sign of an intruder. I checked the back door, and it was still locked. I checked the windows one by one. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house with me. I reached for my phone again, texting my friend. "Something's happening here. I don't know what, but I'm freaked out. I think someone might be here." Her response was quick. "Call the police. Get out of there if you can." I didn't need to be told twice. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered quickly. 911, what's your emergency? "I think someone is in my house. I'm home alone, and I've been hearing noises. I don't know if it's an intruder or if I'm just freaking out, but I'm scared." "Stay calm, ma'am. We're sending someone out immediately. Stay on the line with me." I followed the operator's instructions, keeping the phone close and staying as quiet as I could, my mind racing. Every creak, every gust of wind felt amplified. It felt like hours before I heard the sirens in the distance, but it was only a few minutes. The police arrived, and I unlocked the door for them, trembling. They went through the house, checking each room, each closet. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would explain the noises or the feeling of being watched. The officers reassured me that everything was fine, but the unsettled feeling lingered. They suggested I call someone to stay with me for the rest of the night, and I was more than happy to do so. The storm continued to rage outside, but I no longer felt alone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was one of those dark, heavy nights where the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything it touched. Sarah sat on the couch in the living room, the only source of light coming from the flickering television screen. Her parents were away for the weekend, visiting relatives in the next town over. She had stayed behind, a decision she now regretted, as she listened to the wind howling outside, rattling the windows of their old 2-story house. The storm had arrived earlier in the evening, catching everyone by surprise. It was supposed to have been just a passing shower, but now it seemed relentless, as if the storm had no intention of letting up. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, 8:45 p.m. Her parents had called earlier to check in, reassuring her that they were safe and would be home tomorrow afternoon. There were no issues on the drive, they said, and the rain wasn't as bad in their area. But here, it felt like the storm was taking on a life of its own. The wind picked up again, causing the branches of the trees outside to scrape against the house like skeletal fingers, tapping on the windows. She tried to focus on the TV, but every flicker of light from the screen seemed to make the shadows around her grow longer and more ominous. The house creaked, as old houses tend to do, but tonight, every sound felt louder than usual. Every little creak or groan sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah wasn't sure if it was the storm making everything feel more sinister or if something else was wrong, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call she had received earlier that day, just before her parents had left. Her mom had reminded her to lock the doors and windows and to keep the house well lit. Sarah had assured her everything would be fine. After all, she was no stranger to being home alone. This was different, though. The storm made everything feel different. More isolated, more uncertain. Sarah stood up, her bare feet padding across the cold hardwood floor as she made her way into the kitchen. She needed something to distract herself. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, the thunder rolling across the sky in deep, rumbling waves. She flicked on the light over the stove and opened the refrigerator, pulling out the leftovers from last night's dinner. As she heated it up in the microwave, she absent-mindedly checked her phone. No new messages, no updates, just the usual. A sudden crash of thunder outside startled her, and she dropped the phone on the counter with a small gasp. Her heart thudded in her chest. She sighed, trying to calm herself. It was just thunder. But still, the house seemed darker now, and the storm seemed louder. As she turned back to retrieve her food from the microwave, she heard something. Something faint, but distinct. A knock. A soft tapping on the front door. Her blood ran cold. Sarah's first thought was that it was someone seeking shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor or a stranger who had been caught in the downpour. But then she remembered. She didn't have any neighbors close by. The house sat on a large plot of land, isolated from the main road. The closest neighbor was over a mile away, and no one had come by without letting her know beforehand. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Hello? Is anyone home?" It was a man's voice, muffled slightly by the rain, but Sarah could hear the desperation in his tone. The voice was unfamiliar. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She didn't know who it was, and she didn't want to risk opening the door to a stranger in the middle of a storm. But then she thought of her parents' warning to be kind and to help others when needed. Maybe this was someone who really needed help. Maybe they were stranded and needed to use the phone or get out of the rain. Sarah moved toward the window that looked out onto the porch, heart pounding in her chest. She parted the curtains just enough to see. Through the rain, she could make out the silhouette of a man standing on the front step, his outline barely visible in the dim light. For a moment, she stood there frozen, watching him. He was pacing back and forth on the porch, shifting nervously, glancing over his shoulder as if he were waiting for something. She couldn't tell if he was alone or if someone else was nearby. Her hand gripped the curtain tighter as she stared at him, her mind racing. The knocking started again, more insistent this time. "Please," the voice called out. "I'm soaked. My car broke down, and I need help. Please let me in." Sarah stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make up her mind. The voice was pleading, and she wanted to help, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. Who would be out here in this kind of weather so far from town without some sort of plan? She stepped back from the window, her breath quickening. The rain outside was only getting worse, and her pulse was racing. She needed to think. She was alone. Her parents weren't here. What if this was a trap? What if the man was lying? What if there was more than one person out there? She didn't have a weapon to defend herself, no way to protect herself if things went wrong. Just as she was about to move toward the phone to call her parents, there was another knock, this one even louder. The man's voice followed immediately after, more frantic now. "Please, please, I need help. I'm not going to hurt you. Just open the door." The desperation in his voice sent a shiver through her. She backed away from the door, clutching her phone in her hand. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? Should she just ignore him? The house felt eerily quiet except for the storm raging outside, the wind howling and rain slashing against the windows. Before she could decide what to do, the man's voice came again, but this time it was different. "I know you're in there, Sarah. I can see you through the window. Please, let me in." Her heart stopped. The words hung in the air like a weight. How did he know her name? She had never seen this man before in her life. Panic surged through her, and she backed away from the window, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned toward the door, then to the stairs, unsure of what to do next. Her thoughts were racing. She couldn't stay in the house with him outside, but she couldn't just leave either. What if there was more than one person? What if he was part of some larger plan? Without thinking, she grabbed her coat from the hall closet, her hands shaking as she pulled it on. She had to get out. She couldn't stay in the house anymore. The feeling of being trapped, the sense of someone watching her, was overwhelming. She grabbed her phone, intending to call the police, but as she stepped toward the front door, she heard something from downstairs, a sound of movement, light footsteps echoing from the basement. Her heart froze in her chest. Someone was downstairs. She bolted up the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to call the police to get out, but she couldn't risk being caught in the open. She moved into her bedroom, locked the door, and pulled the curtains back to look out of the window. There was no sign of the man on the porch. But the sense of unease, the weight of being watched, was suffocating. The rain was so heavy now that it felt as if the world outside had disappeared into a gray mist. The house, the storm, the silence, it all blended together into something terrifying. Sarah's thoughts were scrambled. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to do something, but the footsteps downstairs, those were not her own. Someone was inside. The phone rang. It was her mom. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled outside, lashing rain against the windows as if it wanted to force its way in. The storm was relentless, the kind that rattles your nerves, keeping you up long into the night. But inside the house, it was warm and cozy. I had just returned home from a long day of work and school, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening alone. My parents had gone out to visit my aunt for the weekend, leaving me behind to enjoy a few days of solitude. At 22 years old, I was used to being on my own. I was perfectly fine with the quiet, especially when it was accompanied by the soothing sound of the rain outside. I made myself a cup of tea, grabbed a blanket, and settled onto the couch with a book. The house felt different tonight, though. It was as if the storm outside had seeped into the walls and was pressing in on me. But I tried to shake off the feeling. I had always enjoyed being alone. There was something peaceful about it, the way the world seemed to quiet down when no one else was around. As the night wore on, the storm grew more intense. The rain pelted the windows like 1,000 little taps, and the wind whistled through the trees outside, making the house creak and groan. It was the kind of night where you could imagine anything hiding in the shadows. But I didn't let myself think like that. I was an adult, after all. I had my phone, I had the doors locked, and I was in control. I just finished reading a chapter when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint tapping coming from somewhere in the house. I paused, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't move immediately, thinking it was probably the wind or perhaps a branch scraping against the house. It was common during storms. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I sat up, my senses heightened. The sound was coming from the direction of the back door, the one that led into the kitchen. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But there was something unsettling about the rhythmic tapping, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I got up and made my way toward the kitchen. The house was silent now, the only sound the wind howling outside. The kitchen was dimly lit and everything appeared in order. I walked over to the back door and checked the lock. It was secure, just as it should be. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, listening. The tapping had stopped. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I shook my head and went back to the living room, determined to ignore whatever my mind was conjuring up. I grabbed my book again, but this time I couldn't focus. I kept hearing strange noises, a faint thud, the scraping of something across the floor. The storm outside had worsened, the rain now beating against the windows in an unrelenting rhythm. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe the storm was messing with my nerves. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to let it ruin my night. But then, a noise came from upstairs. A loud, unmistakable sound of something, someone, walking around. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. My first thought was that it was my parents, back early from their trip. But then I remembered that they weren't supposed to be home for another day. I had checked their text earlier. The house was completely silent. I hadn't heard anyone come in through the front door, and the windows were all locked tight. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Who could it be? I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, Julie, who lived just a few streets away. Hey, I'm hearing strange noises in the house. I think someone might be here. Can you call me? I hit send, praying she would answer quickly. The sound upstairs continued. It was unmistakable now, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. The house was old, and the floorboards creaked, but these were no ordinary sounds. I tried calling Julie, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic started to grip me. Should I call the police? No, I didn't want to overreact. It could still be a branch or the house settling, but everything about the situation felt off. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone or something was in the house. I moved quietly toward the stairs, my footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. Each step I took seemed to echo through the empty house, amplifying the silence in a way that made my heart pound. I didn't want to go upstairs, but I knew I had no choice. I had to find out what was making the noise. I crept up the stairs, holding my breath. The house was dark, but I had left a light on in the hallway. I reached the top of the stairs and stood still, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The house was eerily quiet again. For a moment, I thought I imagined it all. I was starting to convince myself it was nothing when I heard it again. A loud bang coming from the room at the end of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse quickened. That was definitely not the wind. I moved cautiously toward the sound, my flashlight in hand. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the living room down below. The door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I pushed the door open gently, and the beam from my flashlight swept across the room. Everything appeared normal. The bed was made, the curtains drawn tight, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The window was wide open. The rain was coming in, splashing against the floor, and a draft was swirling around the room. Someone had been in here. I stepped forward cautiously, the floor creaking beneath my weight. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. Had someone broken in? Was it a burglar? Or was there something else going on here? Just as I was about to turn around and leave the room, I heard the sound of footsteps again. But this time it wasn't from upstairs. It was coming from downstairs, from the living room. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever was in the house was moving again. I had to act fast. I ran to the top of the stairs and called out, "Who's there?" The house fell silent once more. No response. I stood at the top of the stairs, my phone in my hand, ready to call the police. But just as I was about to hit the emergency number, I heard the front door open. I didn't move, barely daring to breathe. The door slammed shut again, and I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching the stairs. Whoever it was coming up. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I hide? Should I confront whoever it was? Before I could decide, a voice came from the darkened hallway below. "Emma?" "It's me." I froze, my stomach dropping. The voice was familiar, too familiar. I stepped forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and I saw my dad standing at the bottom of the stairs, drenched from the rain, his face weary from travel. "You're home early," I said, my voice shaky with relief. "We decided to cut the trip short. We tried to call, but we couldn't get through. The storm's really bad." I exhaled, feeling like I had just been holding my breath for hours. I hadn't heard them come in, hadn't heard their car. I thought for sure there had been someone else in the house, someone who shouldn't have been there. My dad gave me a puzzled look as he walked up the stairs, noticing the open window in their bedroom. "What's going on? It looks like someone's been in here." I swallowed hard. I heard noises, footsteps upstairs. I thought I was alone. "Well, you were," he said, looking around the house, "but we're here now. Let's get this storm under control." We made our way downstairs, and he checked all the doors, securing them once more. I still wasn't sure what had happened, whether I'd imagined it or if someone had actually been in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the storm raged on outside, I realized just how much the dark and silence can play tricks on your mind. But the eerie stillness had passed, and with the storm subsiding, I was left with an unsettling quiet. My dad stayed up with me for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep well. The sound of the storm outside kept me awake, and every creak and groan of the house felt like a reminder of how alone I had been. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The storm was fierce that night, much stronger than the forecasters had predicted. The rain came in torrential sheets, hammering against the windows, while the wind howled like a wild animal circling outside. Sarah sat on the couch in her family's old house, staring at the darkened TV screen. She had been watching a movie, but the flickering light from the storm outside was far more captivating. It was already well past midnight, and her parents were away visiting family for the weekend, leaving her alone in the old house for the first time in a while. Sarah had always been comfortable with the house when it was just her. She grew up there, and the creaks and groans of the old wood had long since become familiar to her. But tonight something felt different. The storm, the isolation, the weight of the night pressing in, it was all starting to unsettle her. It wasn't like she had never been home alone before. She had spent weekends alone countless times, but tonight the house seemed to be alive in a way it hadn't been before. Every gust of wind rattled the windows, and every crack of thunder felt like the house itself was shaking. Her imagination began to run wild. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and she reached for it, grateful for the distraction. It was a message from her mom. "Hey, sweetie, how's everything going? Are you okay? It's pretty bad here, but we're safe." She smiled slightly at the text. Her mom always worried about her when she was alone, even though Sarah was old enough to take care of herself. "I'm fine, just a little creeped out by the storm," Sarah replied, typing quickly. "I know, honey, it sounds awful. Just stay inside and lock up tight. Don't open the door to anyone, even if they say they're looking for shelter. I love you." Her mom's words made Sarah's stomach turn slightly. It wasn't like anyone would show up at their house in the middle of a storm, but her mom's warning was one she had heard before. Living in an isolated area like they did meant there weren't many other houses around. The idea of strangers showing up out of nowhere felt both unrealistic and terrifying. She put the phone down, her eyes lingering on the screen for a moment. She was being silly. It was just a storm, and she was fine. She picked up her book, trying to distract herself. The sound of the storm outside was almost comforting in its own way, like a lullaby. But after a few minutes, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind, the one then that made her feel like something was wrong. The wind howled again, louder this time, and she heard something. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A knock. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was soft, almost tentative, but it was definitely a knock. She glanced toward the front door. No one ever knocked on their door this late. In fact, no one ever came to their house at all. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and they were hardly ever home anyway. But still, that knock, that faint, almost hesitant knock, it felt real. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She told herself it was just the wind or the storm playing tricks on her. But then it came again, this time louder, more urgent. Knock, knock. She stood up, frozen in place. Her mind raced. Who would be knocking at this hour in the middle of a storm? Her parents had warned her not to let anyone in if she was alone. She didn't even know who it could be, and the idea of opening the door to a stranger made her stomach churn. The knocking came again, and this time she could hear a voice, muffled by the wind. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help. My car broke down. Can I use your phone?" Sarah felt her heart beat faster. It was a man's voice, rough and breathless from the storm. She knew better than to open the door to a stranger. The warnings her mom had given her echoed in her mind. She should call the police, she thought, or at the very least, not open the door. But then a thought crept in. What if this man really was stranded? What if he needed help? What if something had happened to him out there in the storm? The knock came again, more frantic this time. "Please, I need help. I'm soaked. I just need to use the phone. I won't stay long." Her first instinct was to run to the phone, but then she remembered the old house's lack of reception. There was no signal in most of the rooms. She would have to go outside, and that seemed like an incredibly bad idea. Another knock came. This one harder, the sound of wood cracking under pressure. This time, Sarah didn't just hear the knock. She heard something else. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth on the porch, waiting. The sound made her blood run cold. The voice called again, more insistent this time. Please. I need help. I'm really cold. Let me in. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead as she moved slowly toward the front door. She told herself it was just the storm making her paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Who would be out there, alone in this weather, asking to come in at this time of night? And why was he so determined to get inside? She crept toward the window, her heart racing. The rain poured in sheets, making it hard to see anything outside, but she could just make out the vague shape of a man standing on the porch, his figure barely visible in the dim light. The knocking stopped, but he was still there, waiting, shifting from foot to foot as if he were trying to peer into the house. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest. Something wasn't right. She stepped away from the window, her mind spinning. She needed to call the police. She needed to do something. But what? She didn't know if this man was dangerous or just lost and desperate. The knock came again, harder now, followed by a loud thud that made her jump. Something had fallen, or someone had hit the door. Suddenly, Sarah froze. She heard it. Footsteps coming from inside the house. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from the hallway behind her. Her blood ran cold. There was someone inside. She spun around, her heart in her throat. The footsteps were too close, too real. They weren't from the storm, and they weren't from the man outside. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. The house was locked. The doors were all closed. How could anyone have gotten inside without her hearing them? The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. Then she heard the voice again, faint and distant. The man outside was still calling, still desperate. But the footsteps behind her, they were getting closer. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed into the corner of the living room, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't hear anything else now. Not the storm, not the man outside. All she could hear were those footsteps, slow and steady, moving closer and closer. She grabbed her phone, desperately dialing 911, but there was no signal. She cursed under her breath. The phone dropped from her hands and she reached for anything to defend herself. But there was nothing, just the empty room and the sound of those footsteps. Suddenly, the door behind her opened. She whirled around, her heart racing, and saw nothing. But there was one thing she hadn't noticed before. The door was unlocked. The footsteps outside stopped. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The rain had been falling steadily for hours, thick and heavy, as though the sky itself were wringing out its sorrow. Sarah sat on the couch in her family's living room, the old wood creaking under the weight of the storm. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 10:45 p.m. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving her alone in their old, creaky house. Normally, she would have relished the peace and quiet, the solitude, but tonight was different. The storm outside seemed to seep into the very walls of the house, making everything feel tense and unsettled. She flicked through a few channels on the TV, but found nothing of interest. The flickering light from the screen did little to calm her nerves. The house was unusually silent, save for the occasional creak of the wood or the low hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't like Sarah to feel scared, but something about this night felt wrong. The storm raged outside, winds howling against the windows, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the dark corners of the room. Her imagination began to wander, as it often did when she was alone in the dark. A sudden crash of thunder startled her, making her jump and send her drink spilling across the coffee table. She cursed under her breath and wiped it up with a tissue, her nerves now on edge. She pulled her legs up onto the couch, hugging them close to her chest, trying to distract herself with her phone. She checked her messages, just a few texts from her mom reminding her to lock up and be safe. Her parents had left hours ago, and there was nothing to do but wait out the storm and try to get some rest. She glanced outside. The rain had intensified, pounding against the windows like a drumbeat. The streetlights, just visible through the trees, cast a pale glow, their light distorted by the downpour. The wind had picked up again, rustling the branches outside with a sound that almost resembled whispers. Sarah shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts from her mind. She was being ridiculous. It was just a storm. She had been home alone plenty of times before and had never felt this way. Her phone buzzed again. It was a text from her mom. "How's everything? Is it still storming?" "Yeah, pretty bad," Sarah replied quickly. "But I'm fine, don't worry. Just trying to relax." She leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows. She jumped at the sound, her heart racing. That was when she heard it, a knock. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, more distinct. A sharp, insistent knock on the front door. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who could be out there at this hour? She quickly glanced around the room, like as if the answer would materialize in the dim light. The house was quiet still, save for the sounds of the storm. Her first thought was that it was just someone seeking shelter from the rain, but something in her gut told her it wasn't that simple. The knock came again, followed by a voice, a man's voice, muffled by the wind but still clear enough to make out. "Hello? Is anyone home?" Sarah stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't heard anyone pull up in a car, and the house sat at least a mile away from the nearest neighbor. She wasn't expecting anyone. And why would someone be out there in the storm, knocking at her door? She felt a chill creep up her spine, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. She told herself it was just a neighbor or someone who had gotten lost in the storm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She took a few cautious steps toward the front door, peeking through the curtain. All she could see was the rain, cascading down in sheets, blurring the view. There was no sign of anyone standing on the porch, but the knock had been so clear. It had to have come from somewhere. Her mind raced. What if it was a stranger? What if it was someone who had been stranded in the storm? But how had they even gotten to her door? The nearest road was narrow and barely traveled, and the house was miles from the nearest town. She froze in place as the knock came again. This time it was more insistent, followed by a voice calling out, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to use the phone. I'm stranded in the storm. Please, I'm begging you." Sarah felt a wave of unease wash over her. She wasn't sure what to do. Part of her wanted to open the door and help. After all, it was just a man asking for help. But then the warning from her mother echoed in her mind. Never open the door to strangers. She stood still, listening. The voice outside seemed to carry a note of desperation now, like the man was becoming frustrated. "Please, I need help. My car broke down. I can't stay out here in this storm. Please." Sarah's heart was racing, her palms sweating. The voice sounded real, but something about the situation didn't add up. She glanced at her phone again, considering calling the police, but then she thought of the storm. The phone signal was spotty at best, and even if she could get through, would they be able to respond quickly? The man sounded desperate. What if he was telling the truth? What if she turned him away and something happened to him out there in the storm? But as the seconds ticked by, the feeling in her gut grew worse. The voice outside seemed to be edging closer to the door now, and she realized she had been standing there for too long, thinking, debating, while this stranger waited outside her house in the storm. A sudden crash of thunder shook the house, making her jump. At that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. She couldn't just leave the man out there, especially if he was in trouble. But she also didn't want to put herself at risk. She glanced around the house, looking for something, anything, to defend herself with. But there was nothing close at hand. Then, in a rush of fear, she grabbed her keys from the table and bolted for the back door. If she went outside, maybe she could figure out what was going on without opening the front door. The back porch was covered, and she could at least see if the man was still out there, or if he was just some figment of her imagination. She swung open the door and stepped out into the rain, instantly soaked to the bone. The storm roared around her, the wind whipping her hair into her face. She squinted through the rain, trying to make out anything in the darkness. There, just at the edge of the porch, was a figure. A man, standing with his back to her, looking at the door. "Hey!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. The man turned, startled, and Sarah's stomach dropped as she saw his face. a gaunt, pale man with dark eyes. He looked out of place in the storm, his clothes soaked through. He was shivering, but there was something unsettling in the way he stood, as though he were waiting for her to make the next move. "I'm sorry," she stammered, "but I can't let you in. You need to leave. I'm calling the police." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step toward her, and Sarah instinctively stepped back. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now frantic. "I'm not going anywhere. I need to get inside. Let me in." The desperation in his tone made her pulse race. She was so close to calling the police, but there was something in the way he moved, something too quick, too predatory, that made her second guess everything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, dialing 911 as quickly as she could. "911, what's your emergency?" The voice on the other end was calm, but Sarah could hardly hear it over the storm. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "There's a man outside my house. He says he needs help, but he's acting strange. I don't know what to do." "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Do you have a safe place to go? Are you able to lock yourself inside?" "I'm outside," Sarah stammered. "He's right in front of me. He's not leaving." "Stay calm. We're sending someone your way," the dispatcher said. "Stay inside. Lock all doors and windows. Help is on the way." Sarah nodded, even though she knew the dispatcher couldn't see her. She backed toward the door, never taking her eyes off the man. Suddenly, there was a flash of light in the distance, and the man turned to look at it, his attention momentarily distracted. In that instant, Sarah slammed the door behind her and locked it, her hands shaking as she backed away from the door. The rain pounded against the house, the wind howling outside, and Sarah's heart raced in her chest. But just as she felt the rush of relief, she heard a faint, distant knock. This time, there was no voice, just the sound of someone waiting. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain had started earlier that evening, a gentle drizzle that slowly turned into a torrential downpour. By the time the clock struck 9:30, the storm had taken full force. Sarah sat on the couch of her small 2-story home, her feet tucked beneath her. The house felt cold, even though the heating was on. Maybe it was the storm, its loud, chaotic energy seeping into her otherwise quiet evening. Her parents had left that afternoon to visit her aunt in a nearby town. They'd be back the next day, but Sarah had always enjoyed having the house to herself. No parents, no rules, just the peace and quiet she'd grown accustomed to in the years they'd moved out to the rural area. This was her sanctuary. She didn't mind the isolation. It was a welcome change from the bustle of everyday life. Yet tonight there was something different in the air. The rain tapping against the windows seemed louder than usual, the wind howling as it swept through the trees. The feeling of solitude she usually cherished now felt unsettling. The storm raged outside. The lights flickered once, twice, then remained steady, casting a warm glow in the living room. Sarah wrapped herself tighter in the blanket she'd been using as she snacked on some popcorn, trying to calm her nerves. She had just picked up her phone when the power went out. The room went completely dark for a split second before the emergency lights flickered on, casting a soft yellow hue that did little to banish the sense of unease creeping up her spine. She cursed under her breath, grabbed her phone, and began texting her mom. It was a quick message, mostly out of habit more than anything else. "Power just went out. Hope it comes back soon." A reply from her mom came quickly. "Stay safe, honey. Let us know if you need anything. The storm is crazy here, too." The message made Sarah feel a little better. At least her parents were thinking of her. They always did when the weather was bad. But she also knew there was no real danger, at least not yet. Still, as she sat in the dim light, the wind's wail growing louder outside, she couldn't shake the strange sensation that something wasn't right. A loud crash of thunder startled her, and she glanced at the clock. 10:15 p.m. It felt later somehow, more isolated. She stood up and walked toward the window, peering outside to see the streetlights dimmed by the heavy rain. It was dark beyond the yard, but she could make out the familiar shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. The house was nestled in a small valley, with thick woods surrounding it on all sides. It had always been like this, peaceful, serene. But tonight, the trees seemed to loom larger, casting eerie shadows across the driveway and backyard. She stepped away from the window, a shiver running down her spine. Sarah was no stranger to storms, but this one felt different. It was as if the wind itself was trying to tell her something. But what? Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from a friend. "You good? Heard the storm's pretty bad. You need anything?" "I'm fine," Sarah typed back. "Power's out, though." "Stay safe. Don't open the door to anyone, okay?" The last part made Sarah stop. She'd heard those words before, many times. The warnings from her parents about strangers and storms, about not opening the door to people she didn't know, even if they seemed harmless. She could almost hear her mom's voice in her head, telling her to always double-check who was at the door before answering. The sudden, sharp knock at the front door made her jump. Her heart rate quickened, and she froze, staring at the door as though it could somehow explain itself. Another knock, this one more urgent. The wind roared again, drowning out all other sounds, but she could still hear it. The knock. Sarah's mind raced. Who could be knocking at this hour in the middle of a storm? The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. She hadn't heard a car pull into the driveway. Had someone walked all the way here? No one had ever come to the door this late at night, especially not during a storm. She walked hesitantly to the door, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. Every step felt like a drumbeat in her chest. Standing in front of the door, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Her hand rested on the handle, and she hesitated. Should she open it? Should she even speak to whoever was out there? The voice came next, muffled through the wood, but still clear enough. "Hello? Is anyone home? Please, I need help." Sarah froze. The voice was calm, but there was a certain pleading quality to it that set her on edge. The voice was unfamiliar, but it sounded like a man's, rough, as if worn by exhaustion. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I can help," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to sound confident. "Who is this?" There was a pause. The man on the other side of the door seemed to be thinking. Then he spoke again. "I'm stranded. My car broke down on the road a few miles back. I've been walking for hours in this storm. Please, I just need to use your phone." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced. If the man was really stranded, why hadn't he called someone already? She didn't know how he had found her house, but it seemed impossible that someone could just appear out of nowhere in the storm. Her eyes flicked toward the window, searching for any sign of a car, any movement in the rain. But there was nothing. She bit her lip, considering what to do. It was possible the man was telling the truth. But she couldn't help the gnawing sense of doubt in her gut. What if he was lying? What if he wasn't alone? It was one thing to help someone in need, but it was another thing entirely to invite a stranger inside when you were alone. The knock came again, this time more insistent. "Please, I need help. I swear I won't stay long. Just let me in so I can call for a tow truck." Sarah's pulse quickened. She stepped back from the door and reached for her phone. She needed to call the police. If this man was stranded, they would know how to help. But when she looked at the screen, she realized with a sinking feeling that the signal had cut out. There was no connection. Panic began to rise in her chest. She wanted to call her parents, but her mom had already warned her 1,000 times about strangers at the door. You don't know who they are, and you don't know what they want, her mom would always say. The man outside knocked again. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need help." Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob again. But then, just as she was about to twist it, she heard something else. A sound that made her freeze in place. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the side of the house, heavy footsteps that made the floorboards creak. Her breath hitched, her mind whirling. She had heard no car. There was no reason for anyone to be walking around the house. The man outside stopped knocking. There was a silence that hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the sound of glass shattering broke through the tension. It came from the back of the house, followed by a low, muffled thud. Sarah's blood ran cold. Someone was inside. She rushed to the back door, her feet barely touching the floor as she sprinted down the hallway. The back door was wide open, the glass of the window shattered across the floor, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was still, too still. The knocking stopped. Then came the voice, not from outside, but from the back of the house. "I need to get in." It was followed by a whisper. "I need to get in. I need to get in." Story the end.
Story number 7.
The rain hit the windows in torrents, the sound nearly drowning out all other noise. It had been coming down steadily for hours, and Sarah could see the small rivulets of water creeping up toward the edge of the window, washing away the grime from the glass. The wind howled outside, whipping the branches of the trees around, making the house feel as though it were on the edge of a storm. She had always loved storms, especially when she was home alone. There was something comforting about the rhythm of the rain, the occasional flash of lightning, and the rumble of thunder that seemed to echo from the mountains in the distance. Tonight was different, though. It wasn't just the storm. It was the silence inside her house. Even with the rain and wind, there was a stillness that made everything feel a little too quiet. Sarah wasn't used to it. Usually, when her parents were away, the house felt expansive, like it belonged to her. She could blast music, make a mess, and leave the lights on as long as she wanted. But tonight, the air seemed thick with tension. She couldn't put her finger on why, but the feeling gnawed at her as she sat curled up on the couch, watching the rain distort the world outside. Her parents had left early in the day, headed to her aunt's house in the next town over. They would be back tomorrow, but for now, the house was hers. It was a small house, nestled on the edge of a forest in a quiet suburb, about an hour from the city. The neighbors were spread out, and the closest one was a few houses down the road. Sarah had always loved it here, the isolation offering peace and privacy, especially when her parents weren't around. Tonight, however, the stillness felt oppressive. She glanced over at the clock on the wall. 9:45 p.m. It was getting late. She'd already finished her dinner and was half watching a movie, though her mind kept drifting. The wind rattled the windows again, and the power flickered before stabilizing. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and grabbed her phone from the table to check for messages. The light from her phone cast a pale glow in the room, and for a moment it felt like the storm had taken her away from everything else. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Her mom. "Hope you're doing okay. Power out yet? Let us know if you need anything. Stay safe." Sarah smiled to herself, typing back quickly. "I'm fine, don't worry. The storm is wild, but I'm safe." She hit send and went back to scrolling through social media, her eyes constantly drifting to the window. The rain was heavier now, the wind whistling in the trees, making the house creak with every gust. The storm had intensified in the last hour, and the lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on immediately, and Sarah felt a slight pang of unease. The lights were on a different circuit than the rest of the house, so they didn't usually flicker unless there was an issue with the power lines. For a brief moment, the only sound was the rain and wind. It felt like time had slowed, and the world outside her little bubble seemed distant, almost unreachable. The house felt cold suddenly, as if the storm was seeping into the walls. Then a noise came, a soft thud from somewhere outside the house. At first, Sarah thought it was just the storm, something falling off a tree or a branch swaying in the wind. But then, there it was again, a second thud, louder this time. It came from the side of the house. She paused, listening intently. Her breath seemed too loud in the quiet, her heartbeat quickening. The wind howled again, but it was a distant sound compared to the thud that had echoed through the house. Her instincts told her something wasn't right. Trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her chest, Sarah stood up from the couch. She crossed across the living room quietly, her feet brushing against the carpet as she headed toward the front door. She didn't want to check the windows. She had to force herself to keep her gaze from the darkness outside. It was a small house, so there was only one way to get a look at the side of the house, the front window. The porch light was on, casting a pale yellow glow on the wet steps. She peeked through the curtain. Nothing. Just the trees swaying, the rain pouring down in sheets, the street light faint in the distance. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her nerves. It was probably nothing. It was just the storm playing tricks on her, messing with her mind. But before she could turn away from the window, she saw it. A figure. A shadow moving along the side of the house, too close to the windows for comfort. It was tall, dark, and shifting in the heavy rain. For a second, Sarah thought it might be a trick of the light, perhaps a reflection from a tree branch swaying in the storm. But it wasn't. The shadow was too well defined, too deliberate. It was walking, slowly, methodically, toward the back of the house. Her heart pounded. The storm had become a mere backdrop to the sudden tension that gripped her. Her mind raced, wondering who could be out there. No one should be this close to her house, especially not at this hour. She took a step back, away from the window. The sudden movement felt like a betrayal of her instincts. She wanted to rush to the door and see if it was a neighbor or someone who needed help, but no one would be out there in this storm unless they had a reason. She looked toward the phone again. She should call her parents. But they were an hour away, and even if she did call them, they wouldn't be able to do much. The thought of calling the police crossed her mind, but she hesitated. What could she say? That someone was walking around her house in the middle of a storm? They might think she was overreacting. She heard the thud again. This time it was from the back of the house. Something heavy. Something deliberate. Her throat felt dry as she walked quietly to the back of the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. She reached for the phone on the kitchen counter, and without thinking, she dialed the non-emergency police line. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before someone finally picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I don't know, Sarah stammered. I think someone's outside my house. I heard noises, thuds like someone walking around the side. I'm alone and I'm scared. Okay, the dispatcher said, her voice calm. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know. I don't think so. But I'm home alone and it's storming really badly. The person or whatever it is outside. I can see them through the window. Stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and don't open the door to anyone. The police are on their way. Can you give me the address? Sarah rattled off the address, trying to steady her breathing. Thank you, Sarah. Just stay where you are. Help is on the way. Do not engage with anyone outside the house. Okay. Thank you. The line clicked dead, and Sarah set the phone down, her heart racing. She wanted to run to the door and look, but she knew better. She had to stay calm, stay still, and wait for help to arrive. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones. The storm raged on, the wind howling outside, making the trees groan and creak as though they might fall. Every gust of wind was accompanied by another thud against the side of the house. The sound was getting closer, and now it was accompanied by a voice. A low, guttural murmur that almost sounded like it was coming from the door itself. Let me in, the voice whispered, barely audible over the storm. Please. Sarah froze. The voice was not the one she had heard earlier, the one asking for help. This voice was darker, more insistent, and it was coming from the door. Let me in, please, it repeated. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She turned to look at the door, her heart thudding in her chest. She had locked it when she came inside, but something about the sound of that whisper, the voice coming from just outside the door, made her doubt everything. The rain had stopped for a moment, leaving an eerie silence behind it. But then she heard it again. A soft tap, then another, and then the voice again. Let me in. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night had already begun to fall heavily, and the steady, rhythmic sound of rain hitting the windows was almost hypnotic. The old house creaked with the wind, groaning as it shifted and settled. A full moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting no light on the road that stretched in front of the house. It was peaceful and unsettling at the same time. I had been alone for a few hours, a situation I was used to. At 18, I had long gotten used to spending nights in the house without anyone else around. My parents were away on a short trip, and my older sister was off at college, so it was just me, a quiet house, and the persistent sound of the storm outside. I hadn't intended to spend the night on the couch, but after a long day of homework and stress, I'd sprawled there, my book half read, my mind drifting. A few raindrops started to patter on the windows, and the wind began to howl louder. It had been a stormy evening, but the intensity of the weather seemed to increase by the minute. I glanced at the clock, nearly 11 p.m. It felt so cozy in the house, though the storm outside made everything feel a little more eerie. I hadn't thought much about being alone until the lights flickered. It was an odd, sharp blink. The lights dimmed for just a moment before returning to full brightness, but I could feel a twinge of unease creep into my chest. I hadn't expected the storm to cause any power outages. Our house was well equipped for bad weather. Still, the idea that something might go wrong with the power grid made me uneasy. I shrugged it off. I was used to storms. The house was built to weather them. Minutes later, the lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off for a moment. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the flickering of the lights making the shadows around me dance eerily. I sat up from the couch, my heart beating a little faster now. The storm outside was still wild, and the house groaned as the wind picked up again. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, checking for any messages from my parents. Nothing. The phone was fully charged, so that wasn't the issue. Maybe it was a power surge or something, but the idea of sitting here in the dark with a storm raging outside made me feel more vulnerable than I cared to admit. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but there it was. A knock at the door. I froze. No one should have been here. No one knew I was home alone. Everyone I could think of had left me messages earlier in the day, confirming their own plans for the night. My parents were on their way back the next day, my sister was unreachable, and I hadn't invited anyone over. I stood up slowly, my legs a little shaky as I crossed to the front door. The knock came again. Louder this time. Insistent. My mind was racing, but I couldn't come up with a reason why anyone would be at the door, especially on a night like this. I looked through the peephole. My breath held. There was no one there. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as I stepped back. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though it seemed unlikely given the storm. I turned away, reaching for the light switch, when I heard it. The soft scrape of the doorknob turning. My heart stopped. No one had a key. No one had any reason to be at my door at this hour, and I certainly wasn't expecting a delivery. The wind was howling outside and the rain was coming down in torrents, but that noise, that low sound of metal against wood, made my blood cold. I took a hesitant step toward the door, my mind trying to make sense of what was happening. I peered out the side window beside the door. It was raining too heavily to see anything clearly, but I could just make out the shape of something, or someone, moving across the porch. My stomach turned, and I backed away from the door, fear creeping up my spine. I had to call the police. But what if they left before the police arrived? The thought of someone being out there, watching, was terrifying. And the longer I stood there, frozen in place, the more I began to hear strange sounds that seemed to come from all around me. It was as if the house itself was shifting and groaning with each gust of wind. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The dispatcher picked up, her voice calm, asking for the nature of the emergency. "I think someone's trying to break into my house," I stammered. "I'm alone. I don't know who it is. They knocked on the door." Just then, a loud crash echoed through the house. It came from the kitchen, distant but distinct, as though something heavy had fallen or been thrown. I felt my heart race as panic surged through me. My breath was shallow as I gripped the phone tighter. "Ma'am?" The dispatcher's voice broke through my panic. "Are you okay? What was that noise?" "I don't know," I gasped, my voice rising. "I heard something, like a crash. I'm so scared." "Stay on the line with me," the dispatcher said. "We have officers on their way. Stay where you are and lock all doors and windows. Can you do that?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice shaking. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm in the living room. The front door is locked. I'll lock the back door too." I slowly made my way toward the back of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. As I passed through the hallway, I glanced at the kitchen. The floor was littered with glass shards. Something had been knocked off the counter, but there was no sign of anyone. No intruder. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me as I stepped toward the back door. The doorknob was rattling. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the attic. It sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving across the floor above me. I froze, my entire body tense, and I felt like my feet were glued to the ground. "Ma'am?" The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. "Are you there?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "There's someone in the attic? I can hear them." "Stay calm. The officers are close. Stay where you are. Do not open any doors or windows." I could barely focus on her words. The footsteps above me stopped, and in that moment, the silence that followed felt even worse. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. I heard a low groan from the ceiling above, and then a soft whisper, almost like a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. My mind raced. What if they were already inside? What if they were waiting for me to make a move? I closed my eyes, trying to quiet my thoughts. Just stay put. I clutched the phone tightly, listening for any sign that the intruder was closer. A part of me wanted to run, but I knew that wouldn't help. If someone was in the house, I had to stay hidden, stay quiet. A creak sounded from above again, followed by another step. Then the attic door burst open. The figure standing in the doorway was shadowed, hard to make out against the dim light of the hallway. But I could tell they were tall, broad-shouldered. The figure stepped forward, moving swiftly across the hall toward the stairs. I knew I had to move. My phone was still in my hand, but the fear that gripped me made it impossible to form any clear thoughts. "Ma'am?" The dispatcher's voice came again, urgent. "The police are almost there. Do you see the intruder?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape. But all I could do was stand frozen, waiting for what felt like an eternity, as the sound of heavy footsteps came closer and closer down the hallway toward me. Suddenly, the front door burst open. I gasped, jumping in shock. The officer appeared, shining a flashlight into the living room. "Ma'am?" he called. "We're here." I couldn't believe it. The police had arrived. The tension in the room snapped, and I ran toward the officer, feeling the weight of my fear lifting as the officer led me out of the house. The storm outside felt like a distant memory, and I couldn't understand how much had happened in such a short span of time. As I was escorted out of the house, I looked back once, through the rain and the mist, at the dark silhouette of the attic door. The intruder was still up there. The end.
Story number 9.
It was a stormy evening, and the rain had been coming down in sheets all day. The wind howled against the windows of the small house, and the occasional thunder made the ground shake. Sarah sat curled up on the couch in her living room, wrapped in a thick blanket. The sound of the rain against the windows was oddly soothing, but the occasional crash of thunder made her jump every time. Her parents had left earlier in the afternoon to visit relatives a few hours away, leaving Sarah home alone for the weekend. She had always enjoyed the peace of being by herself, but tonight the storm made her feel isolated. The house felt larger and quieter than usual, and with the wind causing the trees outside to bend and creak, the atmosphere felt a little too eerie. Sarah wasn't exactly scared. She'd been home alone plenty of times before, but tonight, something about the storm seemed different. The wind, the rain, and the way the trees outside looked like dark figures reaching toward the house. It all combined to create an unsettling atmosphere. She told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The clock on the wall showed 9:30 p.m. Sarah had just finished dinner and was about to settle in for a movie when she heard a faint knock on the door. It was odd. Who would be out in this weather, especially at this hour? She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should even answer the door. Her parents had always warned her never to open the door to strangers, especially when they were alone. Another knock, louder this time. Her heart began to race. The logical part of her mind told her it was probably just a neighbor, perhaps someone who had lost power or needed help. But something about the timing, the storm, and the fact that it was so late made her uneasy. She stood up from the couch and walked slowly toward the door, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors. As she approached, she peered through the small window beside the door, but all she could see was the heavy rain and the dark shadows of the night. No one was in sight. The knock came again. This time it was followed by a voice, soft but desperate. "Hello? Is anyone home? I need help." Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. The voice sounded genuine enough, but in the back of her mind she knew it wasn't a good idea to open the door without knowing who was on the other side. "Hello?" she called out cautiously through the door, her voice shaky. "Who is it?" "It's me, Tom," the voice replied, sounding strained. "My car broke down up the road and I've been walking for miles in this storm. I really need to use a phone or get some help. Please, can I come in?" Sarah felt a flash of uncertainty. "Tom?" She didn't recognize the name, but the tone of the voice sounded familiar, almost comforting, like it could be someone from the neighborhood. Still, it was far too dangerous to let someone inside when she couldn't verify who they were. "I'm sorry, I can't help," Sarah said, her voice wavering. "The storm is too bad, and I'm not sure." The voice interrupted her, more urgently now. "Please, I'm freezing out here. I just need to make a call. I won't stay long, I swear." Sarah hesitated. She could hear the desperation in his voice, and yet something still felt off. It was the way he had phrased it. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She wasn't sure what to do, but she wasn't about to open the door to a stranger in the middle of the night during a storm. "I'm really sorry," Sarah said, her voice trembling a little more now. "I can't help. Please, you should try the neighbor's house. They're closer." There was a pause on the other side of the door, and then the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of frustration. "You don't understand. I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to call my wife. She's going to worry." Sarah took a step back, her hand hovering near the lock. The voice sounded increasingly insistent, but she didn't trust it. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. She stood motionless, trying to decide if she should call the police, but before she could make up her mind, a sound caught her attention, something from the backyard. It was a rustling noise, like footsteps moving quickly over wet leaves. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone approach from the backyard. No one had passed by the window. The house was too far from the road for anyone to get close without her noticing. Another rustling sound. And then the unmistakable creak of the gate to the backyard opening. Her pulse quickened. She had to make a decision, and fast. The person at the front door was still knocking, more forcefully now, but her attention was focused on the noise coming from the backyard. She glanced over her shoulder at the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the situation was starting to feel more like a threat than an accident. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table and dialed her mom, but the call went straight to voicemail. She quickly tried calling the police, but before she could press call, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying the back door. Her mind went blank. The front door continued to rattle with the pressure of the knocking, but now the person outside was at the back, trying to break in. In a panic, Sarah sprinted to the living room window and peered through the curtains, trying to see if she could catch a glimpse of anyone outside. The rain was coming down so heavily that it was hard to see much of anything, but then there, a shadow. A figure moving in the rain, slowly walking toward the back door. Her heart pounded. Suddenly, there was another noise, a loud thud from the back door, followed by the scraping of metal. Someone was trying to force the door open. Sarah's breath hitched. The door was locked. The windows were locked. She had locked everything, hadn't she? She looked frantically around the living room, her pulse racing as she heard the sound of glass breaking, the sharp crack of something giving way. The back door, the one closest to the kitchen, was being broken into. She rushed to the hallway and grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy vase, and held it in both hands. She wasn't sure what she would do with it if the person got in, but she needed something, anything, to defend herself. The pounding on the front door was relentless now. Whoever it was desperate to get in. She could hear them yelling, calling her name. "Let me in! Please! I just need to use your phone!" The voice was no longer calm and pleading. It was frantic, panicked. But Sarah wasn't about to let her guard down. She backed slowly into the hallway, the vase in her hands trembling, her eyes glued to the front door. The glass in the back door shattered completely, the sound echoing through the house. The figure outside had broken through. The footsteps grew louder. Then a voice from the other side of the hallway spoke. "Sarah." Her heart stopped. It was her dad's voice. Her father was supposed to be hours away, but there he was, calling her name. "Sarah, it's me. Open the door." Her mind raced, the confusion overwhelming. Had her father somehow come back early from his trip? But if he had, why wasn't he using the front door? Why had the back door been broken into? "Dad?" she called, her voice shaking, but the fear rising in her chest drowned out any sense of reason. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. She tightened her grip on the vase, her fingers white-knuckling the handle. "Sarah," the voice called again. this time closer. "I'm not mad. Please, just open the door." The hairs on her neck stood on end as her pulse quickened. This wasn't her father's voice. It couldn't be. The sound of the footsteps was almost at the door. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, her mind spinning. She had to act. She had to do something. But she wasn't sure what. Suddenly, there was a knock on the front door again, but this time it wasn't a gentle tap. It was a loud, insistent bang, followed by a voice that was almost menacing. "Open up, Sarah. Open the door. You're not safe." The fear in her chest exploded, and without thinking, she bolted for the phone, her thumb hitting the screen as she frantically dialed the police. But as the phone rang, the door rattled violently one more time, and then the phone went dead. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The rain hit the windows with a steady rhythm, creating a gentle drumming sound that mixed with the occasional gust of wind. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The power was still on, and the lights flickered just once before settling into their usual glow. It was a typical rainy night, the kind that felt almost comforting despite the occasional rumble of thunder echoing in the distance. I had been home alone for a few hours, having just finished dinner. My parents were away on business, and my older sister had been visiting friends out of town, leaving me to spend the night by myself. At 22, I wasn't new to being alone in the house. I'd grown up in this house, and even though it was large and sometimes eerie with its creaking floors and old wooden beams, I didn't mind the solitude. If anything, I found it peaceful. After a long week of work and university assignments, I welcomed the chance to relax without anyone around. I'd settled onto the couch, wrapped up in a blanket, watching an old crime drama on TV. My phone sat on the coffee table next to me, and I absent-mindedly scrolled through social media, the rain tapping at the windows as I tried to ignore the soft tension I felt every time the wind howled. The clock on the wall read 9:45 p.m., I had another hour or so before I planned to go to bed. The storm had picked up a bit, and I could hear the trees outside swaying in the wind. The lights flickered again, but it didn't bother me. It had been happening on and off all evening, a result of the storm. A sudden knock at the front door caught my attention. My first thought was that it was a mistake, someone at the wrong house, or maybe a neighbor needing something. I glanced at my phone, but there were no missed messages or calls. I frowned, unsure of who would be at my door so late, especially with the storm worsening outside. The knock came again, louder this time, and I froze. The house had a long, narrow hallway leading to the front door, and it always seemed darker at night. It felt like the walls were pressing in on me as I stood up from the couch. My feet moved automatically toward the door, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. The knock had been too urgent, too firm. It didn't feel like a casual visitor. I peeked through the peephole in the door, but saw nothing. Just the outline of the porch, wet and glistening from the rain. The trees were bent over in the wind, but no one was standing there. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, unsure of what to make of it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady but laced with confusion. No response, just the relentless sound of the rain. I was about to step away when I heard it again, a soft scraping sound from the doorknob. My eyes widened and my heart thudded harder in my chest. I hadn't locked the door when I came home, but I was sure I had latched it when I noticed the storm getting worse. Still, the sound of the doorknob rattling was unmistakable. This wasn't just a simple knock. My mind raced. What if it was a delivery driver or someone needing help? I couldn't risk opening the door without knowing for sure. But what if someone was in trouble? My fingers shook as I reached for my phone, but I stopped. I didn't want to call the police unless I knew for sure something was wrong. I needed to be careful, to think. I stepped back slowly, moving toward the kitchen and grabbing a heavy flashlight from the drawer. It wasn't much, but it would have to do in case things got worse. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, and I could hear the wind howl louder, like some unseen force was trying to push its way through the house. I crept back to the hallway, gripping the flashlight tightly. The rattling stopped for a moment, and then came a slow, deliberate thud against the door, as if someone was trying to break through. My pulse quickened. I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. My phone vibrated suddenly, breaking the silence. I jumped in surprise and quickly glanced at it. It was a message from my sister. "Hey, I'm on my way back. You doing okay? It's storming pretty bad out there." I stared at the message, feeling a strange sense of calm. My sister would be home soon. She'd bring her boyfriend with her, and they'd be here to help me. But still, the unease remained, a deep, gnawing feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Just then, the doorbell rang. I froze. It wasn't the knock or the doorknob rattling anymore. It was the bell. That cold, metallic chime echoed through the house, louder than it had ever sounded before. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, making every second feel like it was dragging on forever. I could hear someone breathing softly on the other side of the door now. Quiet, deliberate. It was too deliberate. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stepped back, my mind a blur of panic. The kitchen windows were locked, the back door was secure, but that door was the only way in, and it was rattling again. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in the house, and that sound, the slow scraping on the door, only made it worse. I reached for the phone again, dialing my parents' number. It rang, but there was no answer. Of course. They were in another time zone, far away, and probably asleep by now. I glanced back at the door, the shadows creeping along the hallway, stretching and shifting. I felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The sound of someone shuffling across the porch caught my attention again. The footsteps were faint, but they were there, moving away from the door. Then there was silence. I waited a few more seconds, heart racing, before I finally took a deep breath. It was probably nothing, just a prank, some kids being reckless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After what felt like an eternity, I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door. I glanced through the peephole again. This time, I saw something. Someone. The face was distorted, almost shadowed, but it was there. Eyes staring back at me. I stepped back in shock, my body freezing in place. The face disappeared, but the scraping continued, this time more frantic. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I had to act quickly. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly dial the number for the police. But I managed. 911, what is your emergency? There's someone at my door, I gasped. I think they're trying to break in. I'm alone. Please help. Stay inside, lock all doors, and stay on the line with me, the dispatcher said firmly. Officers are on their way. How far is your door from where you are now? Just down the hall. I whispered, my voice trembling. Please, hurry. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, and I stayed on the phone with her, trying to keep my breathing steady as I heard the noises outside increase. The doorbell rang again, this time followed by a loud thud as something or someone banged on the door. I swallowed hard, trying to focus. The minutes felt like hours, and every sound from outside sent chills down my spine. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't until I saw the flashing lights through the window that I felt like I could breathe again. The police arrived, their flashing lights painting the darkened street in vibrant colors. The officer approached the front door cautiously, shining a flashlight into the shadows. I could hear them talking, checking the perimeter of the house. Moments later, they returned to the front door. Their faces serious. We've searched the area, one officer said. No sign of anyone outside. You're sure you saw someone? I nodded, still in shock. Yes, someone was here, knocking, rattling the door, and then... I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The officer reassured me, telling me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night. It wasn't until they left that I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I glanced out the window one last time before locking everything up, my mind still reeling from what had happened. The rest of the night was quiet, the storm eventually easing, and I tried to sleep. But the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I kept wondering who it was, what their intentions were, and why they'd chosen that night to knock at my door. I didn't know if I'd ever get the answers I was looking for, but one thing was certain, I'd never forget that night. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It had been raining for hours, a constant, relentless downpour that blurred the world outside the windows. The dark clouds swallowed the sky, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. The wind howled through the trees, bending them in all directions as if the storm itself was trying to tear them from the ground. The small, quiet house was shrouded in the eerie quiet that always came with a storm. Inside, Emma was alone. Her parents had left for the weekend, leaving her behind to look after the house. It was nothing new. She'd spent plenty of weekends alone in the past. But tonight, the storm made everything feel different. It wasn't just the sound of the rain slapping against the windows or the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of the wind. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a sense of stillness that made her uneasy. Emma curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she stared at the flickering light of the TV. She had been watching a movie, but it wasn't holding her attention. Every so often, her gaze would drift to the window, her eyes drawn to the blur of rain and the darkness beyond. The house was old, and the wind always made strange sounds as it slipped through the cracks. Tonight, it seemed louder than usual, the gusts rattling the window panes as if they were threatening to break through. The power flickered once, then twice before finally settling back to normal. Emma's stomach churned. The unease that had been creeping up on her seemed to increase with each gust of wind. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her thumb hovering over the screen. Her parents had left early in the afternoon and wouldn't be back until Sunday. She knew they'd be busy, so there was no point in calling them. It wasn't like she could do anything about the storm. But she still felt that nagging sense of something being wrong, something out of place. The phone buzzed in her hand, breaking her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her best friend, Claire. "Hey, just checking in. How's the storm? You okay?" Emma smiled and quickly typed back a response. "Yeah, just a little creepy. It's really windy. The house is making all these weird noises." She hit send, but as she put the phone back down, she heard something. A noise, soft but unmistakable. A faint thud from the direction of the back door. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was the kind of sound you'd expect from something heavy being set down on the porch, but it didn't make sense. No one should be out there. She hadn't heard any cars pull up, and it was too late for anyone to be visiting. She hadn't seen any movement outside the windows. Her mind raced. It could be the wind, she told herself. Maybe a tree branch had fallen against the door. But that didn't explain why the sound had seemed so close. Another thud. Louder this time. Her heart skipped a beat and a chill ran down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but something told her to check it out. Slowly, cautiously, she got up from the couch, the blanket slipping off her shoulders as she moved toward the hallway. She didn't want to go, but she also didn't want to be sitting in the living room, wondering what the noise had been. The kitchen was just around the corner, and she crept toward it, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She reached the back door, the one that led out to the small porch and then to the backyard. The rain had stopped for a moment, but the wind was still howling. It rattled the glass, making the entire door shake. Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like something was wrong. The feeling in her gut told her not to open it, but curiosity was getting the better of her. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the door. Nothing. She waited, listening intently for any more sounds. The wind howled again, and for a moment the world outside seemed to be alive with the storm's fury. But then there was the unmistakable sound of a faint scrape, followed by another thud. This time, it was definitely coming from the back porch. Emma's heart raced. She stepped back from the door, trying to steady her breathing. Who could it be? A neighbor? A stranger? Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, but the more she thought about it, the less she wanted to open the door and find out. She reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling. There was no service. Of course. The storm had knocked out the signal for the past hour, and she hadn't been able to get a call or text through since then. Her hands were shaking now, but she managed to type out a message to Claire. "Something's going on outside. I keep hearing noises from the back door. I don't know what it is." She hit send, but once again the message didn't go through. Her stomach twisted. She tried to breathe through the anxiety, but it wasn't helping. Another thud, this one accompanied by a scraping noise. That was it. Emma's instincts kicked in. She moved quickly to the front door and locked it, then checked all the windows in the living room, making sure they were secure. She wasn't sure why she was being so cautious, but the unease she felt couldn't be ignored. Every noise, every gust of wind, made her nerves tighten. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting, watching. The power flickered again, and the house was plunged into darkness for a moment before the lights came back on. It felt like the storm was closing in on her. The world outside was completely black now, the rain washing out everything in sight. Then a loud bang from the back door. It shook the entire house. Emma screamed. It wasn't the wind, it was someone or something trying to break in. Her mind raced. Should she hide? Should she call the police? The thought of running upstairs to her room crossed her mind, but she didn't want to leave the lower level of the house unprotected. She had to do something. Without thinking, she grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy flashlight that sat on the kitchen counter. She turned it on, its beam cutting through the darkness. Every noise outside seemed amplified now. The rain pounding the roof, the wind howling in the trees. Another thud from the back door. The house creaked, and Emma's heart pounded harder. She checked every window again, moving silently through the house. She didn't want to make a sound, but the silence was suffocating. The back door was definitely being tampered with, but who would be out there in the middle of this storm? Another bang. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the back door rattled again. This time it sounded like someone was trying to force the door open. She backed into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in her hands. She didn't know what to do, who to call, or how to protect herself. The storm was still raging, and with the power flickering off again, the only light came from the brief flashes of lightning. Then the phone rang. It was Claire. Emma picked up, her voice frantic. "Claire, I'm really scared. There's someone outside. They're trying to break in." "Emma? Are you okay? What's going on?" Claire's voice was sharp with concern. "I don't know. There's someone out there. They're at the back door. I can hear them. What should I do?" "Call the police," Claire said urgently. "Right now." Emma nodded, even though Claire couldn't see her, but just as she was about to hang up and call the police, a loud crash rang out from the back door. It sounded like the door had been forced open. Panic surged through Emma's veins as she ran to the nearest phone, her hands slick with sweat as she dialed 911. The phone rang. Once. Twice, then a click. 911, what's your emergency?" I think someone is breaking into my house," Emma gasped. "I'm alone and I can hear them outside. Please, you have to help me." "Stay calm. Help is on the way. Where are you located?" Emma gave the address, her heart racing with each passing second. The door at the back of the house crashed open again, followed by footsteps. They were inside. Her mind was a blur of panic. "Stay on the line with me," the operator said, her voice steady. "Are there any other exits from the house?" Emma glanced toward the front door, which was locked and secured. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I'm locked in. They're in the house." Another crash from the back. "Help is coming," the operator said. "Stay where you are. Keep the door locked and stay safe." Emma nodded, clutching the phone to her ear, her eyes scanning the dark hallway, praying the police would arrive before the intruder found her. Story the end.